Welcome to the Innovation Meets Leadership podcast. Real inspiration for real innovators. If you're looking for innovation and leadership transformation, your journey starts now.
Welcome to the Innovation Meets Leadership podcast. I'm your host, Natalie Bourne. Hey, did you know my new book is out? Set It on Fire, The Art of Innovation. Head over to setitonfire.co to learn more. Well, my guest today is John Ray, and he is a consultant and a business coach who advises consultants, coaches, attorneys, and other service professionals on some big problems that we often have, which is pricing and business development. So I'm really excited for this today. Typically, when I'm talking to business owners and entrepreneurs, these are the things we talk a lot about. So this is going to be great. He's passionate about how big changes in your mindset, positioning, and also pricing can actually change a business's trajectory and the business owner's lifestyle choices. I'm so excited. He is a #1 national best-selling author of the book Generosity Mindset. So we're going to dive in today to his wealth of background. And this is the most important part. I've also shown up on his platform to talk a little bit about innovation and AI. So you're going to have to check out that episode as well. Welcome to the podcast, John.
Thank you so much, Natalie. And yes, folks, check out that podcast because Natalie dropped some gems.
Well, I'm excited to have you today. And I want to go back a little bit and talk about why you decided to write this book. I would imagine it's pretty closely tied to kind of what you do for a living and how you've been able to help organizations.
Well, I wrote this book because I have all the T-shirts that that come from not pricing correctly, not understanding my value, and it's a natural problem that services providers have. The last time I saw the stat, there were only 9% of business schools in the country that have a course, just one course on pricing.
Wow.
So service providers, no matter how smart and well educated they are, they can come out of business school and not really have a methodology on how to price their expertise. And so that's a problem. The other issue is just the mindsets that hold us back. I mean, when your factory floor is between your ears, that means it's located adjacent to all the mindsets like imposter syndrome that scream at you, right? That, hey, this pricing is just too much, or the client's never going to go for that, or what have you.
Yeah, this is a common challenge when people are first starting a business, or even honestly have been in business for a while, because over time, as we know, things change. And so being able to think about this is a really important part. I'd love to know, what does generosity have to do with pricing? I'd love to kind of get into, because it's a very interesting title for, it's almost like, what are you trying to say there? I'd love to know more.
It's counterintuitive. And thank you for that question, because I get it a lot, and I don't get it enough, actually, because I think people may think I'm a little bonkers with that idea. I do not mean, let's start with that, giving things away. That's not what I mean. In fact, I think one of the problems that services providers have is what I call, and I address it in the book, a mindset of helping, is they want to help everyone. It's the Mother Teresa syndrome. Well, you've got to be in business in order to help those you want to help, right? You cannot, by definition, go out of business by helping everyone and continue to do that great work that you do. So I think that's one thing. What I'm getting at is really a mindset shift. And that shift is to get out of your own head about the value that you think you're creating and make sure you make it about the client, that you have the conversations necessary to understand the value the client sees in your work. Because if you do that, what I'm convinced of is you will find out the client thinks you create more value than you believe yourself.
Wow. Well, let's step back and say, what is value? So when we're thinking about value that we provide, how would someone, let's say they're in the professional services industry, or maybe, one of those industries that we mentioned in your bio, how would they start by defining what is value? And then how would they kind of cross that chasm to figure out, how do I know what I believe value is aligns with what the customer believes value is?
Yeah, that's a great question. To me, you can break it down essentially into two buckets, if you will. The first is tangible value. So, as the client get from that service itself, I get a tax return prepared, or I get the project completed that I've hired that consultant for. Then there's the intangible value. So, what now am I able to do because of that transformation of that work
Mhm.
that has been planted in my company, and for me personally as a business owner,
Mhm.
by my service provider. So let's take the consultant, for example. I mean, if a successful project has been brought to a close and I now have cut my expenses by 15%, let's say, what
Mhm.
am I able to do with that profit
Mhm.
and that extra profit? How many people can I hire, for example, that I've been wanting to and I couldn't before? Or how can I grow in organic ways that I couldn't before? And what does that do for me? What does that do for me, not just as a company, but personally? I get to spend more time with my family, maybe, or maybe just the ego of having a bigger company, right? And there's value along that chain of thinking, if you will. And the problem that we as service providers have is we don't adequately define that.
Mhm. Well, what I like about what you're saying is most of us stop at the savings, right? So if you do this, you'll save X. But I like what you just said, because it's not just the savings, it's the savings redeployment. So now, as a result of saving that, let's start to dream about, what can you do with that money you just saved? How can you redeploy that to either, make your life easier? So maybe you can hire that role that enables you to actually leave work at 5 p.m. every day. Or maybe that enables you to work more on the business and not so much in the business. So I like the thinking there, because it's taking it to that additional step. It's not just the savings, it's the savings redeployment that gets you that 10x factor that I think a lot of businesses are looking for.
My favorite example there, that I've used tongue in firmly in cheek, Natalie, is how does your spouse, how do they feel about being able to vacation in Rome, Italy versus Rome, Georgia? That's high
Big difference.
tangible. That's high tangible value. Okay.
So going back to your bio, that's the lifestyle changes we were talking about there.
That's right.
No,
Exactly.
that's great. I mean, so let's talk about something that most business owners and entrepreneurs are really nervous about, and that is when they raise prices or share the price, they're afraid of scaring off their client, right? How do they ensure their client doesn't run off screaming when they slide the price across the table?
Well, that's the moment of truth. And that's where your knees are knocking and you're sweating, and yes. So here's what helps your confidence dramatically. If you can do that after having had an effective value conversation that gets into where the client sees value, both tangible and intangible. And I'm convinced that your ability to price confidently depends on the effectiveness of that conversation and your willingness to dive into it. Um,
Mhm.
so often we cut short these conversations in the interest of getting to that proposal stage when we really ought to extend it out. Because if we do, we'll have a lot more confidence in that we've identified that value and that we've priced fairly and appropriately to that value.
So, what you just said is a really important inflection point, because when I've gone against my own instincts and a client has tried to kind of force me through my normal path that I like to take with them, and I had somebody who reached out to me on LinkedIn. I think we were on the call the next day and they wanted a proposal, and I'm thinking, this is not my normal path. It doesn't happen this fast.
Right.
And so, once they got that proposal, they ran for the hills. Why? Because there is a method that helps the not only you better understand what the customer needs, but the customer better understand what you can provide. And when that's done out of lockstep, you have this misalignment, and it's, maybe they're looking for the cheapest thing, and that's probably not a good fit for you. But let's talk about that a little bit, because I think that's so profound, and I'd like to back up a little bit, because I do think this is where most salespeople, most business owners, founders, entrepreneurs, this is kind of the fail point of how to bring somebody along and not rush that process, even if the customer's asking you to rush the process.
Yeah, and that's hard because the customer wants to get, understandably, they want to get to what the bottom line on this is going to be. And I think a couple of things there. First of all, let's take the example you mentioned. If you've got a client who is, the first few questions out of the box, it's about price, probably don't have a good fit right there.
Mhm.
I mean, that's a tell in my book. So that's probably you have to put that client in that bucket and engage accordingly or disengage accordingly, right? I think the other piece of that is, how do you, having a methodology for how you have this conversation, and having questions that you typically ask in a conversation, so it doesn't become so open-ended that the client's tapping their foot and you're going nowhere. I think that's an issue. But then in the middle of that conversation, when the client's trying to short circuit it, is to say simply, hey, I know some of the questions that I ask may not seem appropriate to
Mhm.
the service that we're talking about, but I want to make sure I'm here to service your needs, even if that doesn't benefit me. And I want to make sure I'm a good fit for you. And that's part of what I call that generosity mindset,
Mhm.
is presenting yourself as a professional of value and genuinely being ready to walk away from the business if that's not appropriate at this time. And what you will do by doing that is establish yourself in that client's mind as the provider they want to do business with whenever that need arises in the future. But most typically, what's going to happen is they're going to want to go forward with you and understand how they can do business with you, and they will continue to engage in that conversation.
Well, this kind of leans into something you talk about in your book, which is how there's a strong connection, right, between self-confidence and business success. And so let's talk a little bit about that, because it does take confidence to do a couple things, right? To interrupt their normal default mode of how they want to work with you, to make sure you're pushing back and following the right methodology to lead to the right results, and ultimately making sure that you're serving them well and providing the value that you'd like to be able to set in place for them.
I think it gets back again to really projecting yourself into the mind of that client and trying to pull out their perception of how they want to be served, where they see a value, what's going on with them in their totality, in their business, not just in what the problem you're ostensibly there to solve, not just what they inquired about. Their problem may be a lot bigger than what you can provide. I mean, here's an example. I had a client here in the last couple of weeks I was talking to, that she thought her problem was pricing. And frankly, it is pricing. But the truth of the matter is, we had after about a 15-minute conversation, it's clear that her problem was volume. It was not price. I mean, if the volume gets high enough, yeah, let's talk about the pricing. But we need to talk about the volume you have. You don't have enough clients. And
Mhm.
so that's the problem that needs to get solved. But that's not the reason she called me. So you've got to be able to dig in there. And if you are able to point that out to clients with confidence, they will know that you're a professional of value. They'll see that. And, that particular engagement, I didn't get that day. But whenever she's ready to engage about pricing, I'll be the person she calls, and I'm going to be the person that she refers.
Well, here's what I find interesting about that is that, in my situation, I find that 80% of the time, the reason that someone calls is not the real reason of what they actually need, right? And so they may call with this premise or this idea of what they think they need, but there's always something rooted 2 and 3 and 4 levels deep of what the actual need is. And so in that way, it's like when someone comes to the doctor's office for a checkup and, "Hey, I've got a headache." Well, you have a headache because it's really your back's out of alignment, which is causing you to do all these other things. And so if we align your back, headache will go away. And so oftentimes I find that that's true, that if you're going to be in the space, you have to be very curious, very good at asking questions, very good at going below the surface of what someone's asking you for.
Yeah, that's a great point. And you also, I think, need to assume that no matter what the client says, they really don't know what you do. Now,
Mhm.
I know that sounds crazy to some people because, like, let's take you as an example. You're an innovation expert, but what a lot of people may not know about you is that you're an expert on strategy.
Right.
Well, the client may need the strategy before they need the work on innovation, right?
That's right.
But they've called you because they think they need some help with their innovation processes, right? Or something like that. And you find out in a conversation that we've got a strategy problem here.
Yeah.
But if you didn't have that conversation, you would be working on the wrong piece of the puzzle with their blessing, but it would be an unsuccessful engagement and
Right.
none of you would be happy. And so that's a simple example, but the point is that clients don't really know everything that you as a service provider are capable of. And so that's why you've got to have that conversation.
Mhm. That's so good. I would love for you to talk about what are some other practical concepts that you want to pull forward from your book that you think would help someone as they're on this journey? Because I think that this book is chock full of, and you said, "Hey, I have the T-shirt." That's why we're talking about this stuff because I've done it the wrong way in order to help you do it the right way. And it's funny. When I first moved into consulting, I called a friend of mine and I was telling him about it, and he just stopped me and said, "Hey, you're doing it all wrong, and it's okay." When I moved into consulting, so did I. And then we started talking about that. And so I just love this because this book is like having a mentor. It's having someone come alongside of you and say, "Hey, you're doing it wrong, but that's okay. Let me show you a better way." So I'd love to know if there's any other practical items we should be talking about that we haven't covered.
Well, I think your friend pointed to something that's really important is give yourself grace. We've all made mistakes
Yep.
and we've all done it wrong. We've all got those things that we've screwed up, and that's just the tuition we pay for getting it right.
That's right.
So give yourself grace. It's okay. That's the most common thing I have to go through with a client is, I was so stupid to have done this. Well, guess what? I
Yeah.
mean, we don't have time to tell my stories. So, in fact, that's why I wrote the book, to tell some of mine. So I think that's one thing. I think the other thing, just from a practical point of view, is not all your clients are the same. They may call you for the same thing, but they're not all the same. They don't value you the same. So their perception of value is different. So it's just like my perception of coffee may be different from yours. I mean,
Mhm. you
you may think coffee is fine wine and are willing to pay a lot per cup. I don't happen to be, I have no taste for coffee. So I'm going to wait till I get to your office and let you buy me whatever you got in your office, right?
Right.
The point is that you need to differentiate your services. You need to create options for clients that don't perceive as much value and therefore they're happy to get the basic model, and the clients that want the premium. They want to get behind the Natalie Bourne velvet rope. They want everything Natalie can give them. And so for those clients, you want to charge a hefty premium because they're willing to pay it. And the
Mhm.
value you're going to give them is a great return on that investment, even though it seems high, quote unquote.
Right. And I think that's important. Usually you can charge a premium for those that call you, right? So understanding that eventually as you spend time in the space that you're in, your reputation will begin to precede you. You'll start to get the phone calls, you'll start to get those referrals. And if someone calls you, you can always demand a time on, premium for your time in those situations. And I think this is important because oftentimes, and I don't know why this is, but pricing and how to price what you're doing is so critical. It's interesting in the product space, John. Usually when I work with someone who's launching a product, we spend a lot of time working with some of their direct customers that they'll want to offer this to find out their pricing sensitivity. So we'll
Mm.
spend a ton of time looking at, hey, if something had this feature, how much would you pay for it? If it did this but not that, how much would you pay for it? And really asking, and oftentimes we think that the customer is always going to choose the lowest price. But when you're asking them in that space, they're really thinking about, well, how much value do I see out of this thing that you're offering me? And these are the benefits that you're telling me. And so you would think, you put a spreadsheet of prices in front of somebody, they're just going to hit the lowest and say that. But oftentimes they're thoughtful and, well, no, I mean, this is a $50 a month per seat product, or this is a $200 a month per seat product. And here's why I think that. And so it sounds maybe even a little counterproductive to say, in a survey setting, you should ask your client. But I've found that oftentimes I'll ask the person, how much would you price this at? And then we go in and have these surveys, and oftentimes their customers price it 2 and 3 times higher than they personally would have priced it. And so they were kind of missing the signals of the market if they had just gone with what they thought. And so often I think when we look at our own services, what we bring to the table, the value, we're wrong. And we can charge a premium for something we're offering, and we don't realize that.
Yeah, for sure. And you've got to realize that pricing is a marketing signal. It's a signal of quality, it's a signal of inferiority, depending on where you price.
Mhm.
So if you price at a point that the client thinks is too good to be true, they're not going to hire you.
Yeah.
So you have got to be expensive enough, if you will. I hate to use that word because that gets their hackles up, but it needs to be high enough relative to the value you create to be indicative of that value. The other side is true too. If you price to value that you create, then what you're doing is you're sending a signal to that client that, hey, I'm a professional of value
Mhm.
here. And so it's really important to understand that clients judge the price in and of itself.
That's good. What final thoughts would you have for our listeners today? This has been really good. And I think this is the first time we've really sat down and talked about pricing and value on the podcast. So I get even more excited because I can't wait for the audience to listen to this podcast and really think thoughtfully about how they're pricing and positioning themselves.
I think the most important concept in the book is understanding that others see more value in you and your services and what you can bring to their table than you see yourself.
Mm.
And it doesn't matter how good you think you are at judging yourself, you cannot take the top of someone's head off and look down into it and see how all the places they see where you provide value. So if you are mindful of that and act on that, be willing to have the conversations and be willing to do the check-ins with clients, then what you will find is you deliver enormous value relative to what you might have thought, and your ability to price gets much easier.
This is so good. John, where can people find and follow you, and where can they get your book?
Well, thank you again for having me on, Natalie. I'm grateful. You can find my book at thegenerositymindset.com. You can learn more about the book, and it can be found at your favorite bookseller, ordered there, or online. You can connect with me at johnray.co. That's my website. And I'm on LinkedIn, John Ray 1, the numeral 1 on LinkedIn. So connect with me there because I'm pretty active there, just like you are.
And then, John, you actually host 2 podcasts. So take just a second, because I'm going to be on one of those 2 podcasts, but take just a second and talk about your other platforms so that people can go follow you there as well.
Thank you for that. Yeah. So I have a couple of podcasts, and the one that's focused for professional services and the work I do there and the generosity mindset is called The Price and Value Journey. That name because it's a journey. We're all on a journey to understand this. It never ends, and that's okay. That's the name of the podcast. And like yours, it's found on all the major podcast platforms.
Awesome. Well, it's been an absolute pleasure and joy to spend a lot of time with you today, because I was on your podcast first and then now you're on mine. So
Right.
I'm excited for people to not only listen here, but then to also head over to John's podcast to learn a little bit more. Thanks again for your time.
Thank you, Natalie.
Well, to our listeners, thank you for joining the Innovation Meets Leadership podcast. Remember, don't just get out of the box, break the box and set it on fire. Let's go transform something.
Thank you for joining us for the Innovation Meets Leadership podcast. Be sure to subscribe to our show on iTunes. Follow us on Instagram or Facebook at Innovation Meets Leadership, and visit our site at innovationmeetsleadership.com for more innovation resources.
Hey, my new book is out, Set It on Fire, The Art of Innovation. Click on the link to learn more. And don't just get out of the box, break the box and set it on fire. Let's go transform something.